At the end of May of this year, I celebrated my 50th birthday. And over the course of these 50 years, I've lived in 6 different states in the US. I've lived in New Mexico, Colorado, Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio, and of course, the greatest state of them all, Texas. And even within these states, I lived in different cities, like a couple different cities in Ohio, a couple different cities in Oklahoma, and I think 5 different cities in Texas. I mean, if you were to kind of keep track of all the places that I'd moved, you would think that for a while I was on the run from the law or something. Well, I guess for a couple of those moves, I was on the run from God, but that's a different story for a different day. So during all of these moves, you could kind of say that my biography could be mapped, that you could trace on the map my life. My wife, Stacy, and I both grew up in the same small town in Texas. It's called Shamrock, Texas. And we've observed a kind of odd fact about how we refer to that place. You see, we spent our young years there, those kind of awkward teenage years in Shamrock, and we transitioned from being teenagers to young adults while we were there. And my parents, my sister, they still live there. Stacy's family still lives close by. And the odd fact that we've observed is that anytime that we talk about going home, we talk about going back to Shamrock. Now, neither one of us have lived there for a long time, but for us, that is where our home is. That's where we were teenagers. That's where we became young adults. That's where we made all of these memories and had all of these experiences when we were young. And so anytime that we're going home, that's where we're headed, back to Shamrock. Well, today we're going to talk about another home. We're going to talk about Israel's home. And we're going to map her biography as well. But as we do, we're going to have to talk about something that's kind of an uncomfortable and awkward truth. And it's this. When we're talking about Israel's home, and actually when we're talking about our own home as well, it's not what we might expect. Because Israel's home is actually not the land flowing with milk and honey. And my hometown is not really Shamrock, Texas. Israel's home and my home, and actually the hometown of all of you who are watching this, is the land of the Pharaohs. Israel's hometown, the place where Israel's heart was, is Egypt. And the place where my heart is Egypt. And it's the same for all of you. The title of this presentation is, So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. But it could just as well be entitled, So You Want to Go Home. Now, speaking of home, and speaking of moving, let's talk for just a second about what's called cultural assimilation. So for immigrants to the United States, I would say that by the second and for sure by the third generation, they are pretty much assimilated to the new place. I mean, they're assimilated according to the language, according to the traditions, and in a lot of cases, according to the religion as well. They are fully culturally assimilated. So for instance, let's say that great-grandpa Schmidt moved over from Germany to the US and settled in Pennsylvania. Well, for him, he probably spoke German still in his American home. And he probably ate German food at his American table, and he read German newspapers, and he read German books in his American easy chair. Okay, but what about his great-grandkids? Well, his great-grandkids they're sending Snapchats, and they're watching TikTok videos while they eat hamburgers and fries. I mean, they're fully part of this country. They don't see themselves as somehow outsiders. They have been assimilated to this culture, for good or for ill. That's just the way it works. Now, what I wanted you to do is think about cultural assimilation in connection with the people of Israel. How did they assimilate themselves, or how were they assimilated to the whole culture and ideology and religion of the land of Egypt? Because I don't know if you've stopped to think about this, but how long was Israel actually in Egypt? Well, it turns out they were there for an awful long time. They were there for, just kind of put it in our own context, they were there for almost twice as long as the United States has existed as a nation. So if they were there for that long, for almost half a millennium. Well, just think of all the ways that they were assimilated to Egypt. They would have learned the language. They would have learned the customs. They would have learned the traditions of Egypt. And probably in some cases, there would have been intermarriage between Israelite families and Egyptian families. So over the course of this very long period of time, Israel was assimilated to the land of Egypt. And at the same time, Israel would have been daily surrounded by the smorgasbord of divinities that were all through the land of Egypt. I mean, there's the ones that we probably all have heard of, like Osiris and Horus, but there were gods of medicine, there were gods of magic, there were gods all over the place. And not only that, but if you think that politicians today might think too highly of themselves, and I won't argue with you there, well, just think of the main politician in the land of Egypt. He had theological backing for it because the Pharaoh was considered to be an actual divine incarnation. So you couldn't throw a rock in Egypt without it landing on the head of a god. In fact, the rock itself might be divine. Now, here's my point. In this land, in Egypt, reeking of idolatry, that stink in one way or another was going to stick to Israel. It reminds me of something that I experienced several years ago when I was driving a truck in San Antonio on a delivery route. My delivery route took me close to the H-E-B grocery warehouse, and close to that was it was a water purification plant. And this water purification plant stunk to high heaven. I mean, it just reeked. Every time I drove by the street in front of it, I had to hold my nose. It was that bad. But one day, I had to stop in front of it because I had a delivery to make there. So I parked my truck and I got out and I walked toward it. And of course, the closer I got, the more overwhelming the stink became. And I knocked on the door opened, and this wave hit me coming from within. Well, I ended up making the delivery, and the employee signed my ticket, but I just had to ask him. I mean, I just had to know. So I said, man, you got to tell me how in the world you're able to work at this place when it stinks so bad. And I'll never forget his response. He laughed like he'd been asked that lots of times. And he said, sir, you can get used to damn near any stink. Now, that was a throwaway comment from him, but it's always stuck with me because there's a lot of truth embedded in that comment. I mean, the longer that we are around some stink, the longer that we are around some evil, well, the more that we just kind of grow accustomed to it. It becomes the air we breathe. It's the water we drink. It sticks to us. And after a while, we don't even realize it's there. It becomes so much a part of the atmosphere around us. Well, that's exactly what was happening in the land of Egypt with Israel. They were around the stench of idolatry so long that it became the air they breathed, the water they drank. It was something that was affecting them in ways that they probably weren't even aware of. That's what happened with Israel in Egypt. Now, am I saying that it was inevitable that Israel would begin to worship other gods besides Yahweh, or more likely to worship other gods alongside Yahweh? I'm not saying it was inevitable, but was it probable? Yeah, in fact, it was more than probable. We know that it actually happened. So here's one of the points I want to make. Don't let the enslavement of the Israelites by the Egyptians blind you to a very important fact. Long before the Egyptians placed chains on the Israelites had placed the chains of idolatry around their own souls. And long before the Egyptians put the Israelites into like physical slavery, they were in a kind of spiritual slavery that they had put themselves in. And long before the Pharaohs made the Israelites build cities for them, the Israelites had erected tiny temples to Egyptian gods within their own hearts. And we know this because the scriptures tell us this multiple times. In fact, we hear it first in the book of Leviticus. Listen to what God, through Moses, tells the Israelites. Talking about the Israelites, so they shall no more offer their sacrifices to the goat demons after whom they whore. Leviticus 17:7. He says, no more. In other words, they got to stop. They've been offering sacrifices to goat demons. This needs to end. Also, we read in Joshua 24, so generations later, Joshua says to the Israelites, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt and serve the Lord. He doesn't say don't start. He says put these gods away, the ones that you have been worshiping from Egypt all the way through the wilderness, and even now that we have entered into the promised land. And the worst of all is when Ezekiel talks about what the Israelites were doing with idolatry in Egypt. This is from Ezekiel chapter 20. He says, God through him says, I told the Israelites to cast away the detestable things their eyes were feasting on, every one of them. Don't defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. But, Ezekiel says, God through Ezekiel says, but they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. None of them cast away the detestable things their eyes feasted on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. So, what's the point here? Well, if you fostered any idealism about Israel's monogamous commitment to the Lord, well, you can just kind of put that naivety aside. Yes, we are told that they sighed to God. They cried out to him to send them someone to rescue them. But if what we know from the rest of the scriptures is true, then they were probably crying out to other gods as well. We certainly know that they weren't sitting around in a circle and holding hands and singing Kumbaya Yahweh, crying out to God to send them some sort of redeemer. In fact, remember what happens when Moses shows up in Egypt? They immediately reject him. And they say, you're just making our life worse than it was before. That's the joy of prophetic ministry right there in the life of Moses. Okay, so here's the cold hard truth. The people of God were never the people of just one God. You can kind of think of it this way. Suppose you know a guy who's dating this girl. In fact, they're engaged to be married. Wedding bells are in the air. But here's the problem. Every time the guy goes to work or goes to hang out with his friends, the girl is sleeping with a guy from the gym, or she's sleeping with the guy next door, or she's sleeping with a university classmate. I mean, anyone that she can get into her bed, she's sleeping with. Well, that guy is Yahweh, and that girl is Israel. Israel is not the kind of girl that you want to marry. With her lips, she may say monogamy and monotheism, but with her heart and in her actions, she says polyamory and polytheism. So I lay all that out because I think it's going to help us to get to the answer to this question. So you want to go back to Egypt, or so you want to go home? You see, I think that we really ask the question wrongly. We get the question completely backwards. I mean, I used to struggle with this, and I think people still struggle with this, asking the wrong question. And the wrong question is this: why would Israel ever want to go back to Egypt? Right? You probably wonder that. Why? They were enslaved there. So why, when they're in the wilderness, are they always wanting to go back? That doesn't make any sense. No, that's the wrong question. The wrong question is to ask why they ever wanted to go back. Here's the right question. The right question is why, once they got out of Egypt, didn't they right away kill Moses, pack up their stuff, and go back to Egypt as quickly as possible? That's the right question to ask. That is what is astonishing. What's amazing is not that they grumbled and complained so many times in the wilderness. What's amazing is that they ever stopped groaning and complaining and threatening to take down Moses. And I'll add this. What's amazing is not once they got to the foot of Mount Sinai, they built this golden calf. Oh, that's not shocking at all. What's shocking is that at every stop along the way, they weren't also building golden horses and golden camels and golden cats and dogs and whatever else. In fact, it reminds me, several years ago, there was this cartoon in the New Yorker. And so it pictures Moses is in the background. And he's just come down from Mount Sinai. He's got the 2 tablets of stone in his hand, and his face is mad, you can tell, because he's standing in front of the golden calf, and he's about to smash these tablets. And in the foreground, there's a couple of Israelites standing side by side, and they're next to a tent. And right beside the tent, on the other side of it, are all these collections of animals. And so one of the Israelites tells the other Israelite, maybe we shouldn't tell Moses about the other golden animals. And I suspect that is precisely the truth. In fact, you ever think about this? When Aaron built the golden calf, when the Israelites asked him to, and he built the golden calf, you ever notice that he really seemed to know what he was doing? I mean, it wasn't like he had to pull out his iPhone and watch 3 or 4 YouTube videos on how to build an animalistic icon. It was like this was not Aaron's first rodeo. He knew what he was doing when he built the golden calf. So, with all that said, we are now in a position to diagnose exactly what Israel's problem was. And in so doing, to understand our own problem as well. So, why do we seem so often hell-bent on personal destruction? Why every time that we turn around, are we doing something that really screws up our life, that fractures relationships, that endangers our faith? Why, once God has brought us out of slavery, are we always looking back and yearning to go into those chains and into that captivity once more? Why, once we're with God in the wilderness, on the way to the promised land, are we always looking over our shoulders, hankering to go back to the land of Egypt? Well, despite what we often hear, Israel's problem was not ingratitude. Please don't say that. Israel's problem was not that they were just not thankful enough for what God had done for them. Now, I don't disagree. I mean, they certainly were full of ingratitude and they were unthankful, but that is not the issue. So, what is the issue? Well, the issue is this. The issue is not that they were just sinful, but the issue is that Israel, their problem was always religion. That was why they wanted to go back to Egypt. You see, it wasn't as if Israel had grown less and less interested in the things of religion. No, they had grown more and more captivated by the stuff of religion. In fact, they were in the perfect spot for becoming completely engrossed in the things of religion. I mean, just think about it. They're in Egypt, and so they can worship a little Yahweh. They can worship a little fertility goddess. They can worship a little golden frog, worship a little Nile. They kind of mix all this together to whatever their religious palate was interested in. They can mix it all together in this big liturgical, idolatrous casserole. So, as the saying goes, God could get Israel out of Egypt, but he couldn't get Egypt out of Israel, because home is where the heart is. And Israel's heart, the zip code of their heart, that address was Egypt. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, all right, Chad, that's all well and good, but that is not our problem today. Today, people are not crazy about religion like the Israelites were in Egypt. I mean, we've got the exact opposite problem that Israel had, because today people, they're not interested in religion. They're becoming more and more secular. That's our problem. So we've all heard about this, the new category of the nones, right? That's N-O-N-E-S. And of course, the nones are those who, when you ask them, are just not really that into religion. They're not affiliated with any particular religious organization. So they're no religion. Those are the nones. Well, this is where the church needs to step in and say, not so fast, buddy. See, here's the problem. We've turned our tongues over to society to teach us how to speak. Rather than imitating and echoing the voice that comes from our Heavenly Father through His Word, we've begun to listen to other voices that teach us how to talk. We've let the screen of our iPhone teach us how to talk. We've let social media or cable news or politicians or university professors or whoever teach us how to talk instead of listening to the speech of our Heavenly Father. And We've learned new words like secular, or new phrases like non-religious. But here's the problem. The joke's on us, because those things don't even exist. A secular person? No. A non-religious person? No. That's just as real as Bigfoot riding on the back of a unicorn. Here's what I mean. As human beings, we can choose not to do many things, right? We can choose not to eat our vegetables. Personally, I choose never to eat cauliflower in any form or fashion. We can choose not to watch certain sports. You can choose not to watch football. You can choose not to watch rugby. We can choose not to shave. As you can see, I've chosen that particular option. But here's one thing that we cannot choose not to do. There is one aspect of being a human that we certainly cannot avoid being: religious. We are religious people from head to toe, from heart to mind, from January through December. James K.A. Smith defines people not as Homo sapiens, but as Homo liturgicus. That is, liturgical people, worshiping people, people with a religion. So being a non, N-O-N-E, that's not an option. The question is, what religion or what kind of amalgamation of religions is it going to be? Because being a secular human is just as impossible as being an elephant human. You may be familiar with a famous commencement address by David Foster Wallace called Water. Recommend just reading the whole thing, but here's one little snippet that's always stuck with me that addresses this particular question. He writes this: "Here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." He goes on, "And the compelling reason for choosing some god or spiritual type thing to worship, whatever it is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive." He says, if you worship money or things, if that's where you kind of tap meaning in your life, then you're never going to have enough. You never feel that you have enough. He goes on, worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you'll always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you'll die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. End of quote. Now, I think this proves very helpful when we're engaging people that we encounter who claim to not have kind of any interest in religion. Because religion encompasses so much more than what we think of usually when we talk about ritual or creed or faith, because there's the little r religion, as it's sometimes called. It's the mechanism, as our friend Dave Zoll points out, it's the mechanism, these little r religion, the mechanism by which we manage our guilt, right? Or we deal with our shame. You could think of it this way. Your little r religion is what gives you meaning and place and purpose in your life. Your little r religion is what tells you that you matter. It's what keeps you going. It's what pulls you out of yourself to where you feel like you're involved in something bigger than just you. So the real question is not whether you're religious or secular. The real question is, what is your religion? What's it going to be? Well, let me illustrate this with just a couple of modern examples. But before I do that, I want to tell you about a basic biblical truism. A scholar named G.K. Beale is the one that I got this from. And it's this. So we resemble what we worship, and we reflect that worship to the world around us. We resemble what we worship, and we reflect that worship to the world around us. There's a couple of key biblical passages that teach this. One of these is from Psalm 115. It's talking about those who worship idols. And here's the quote: "Those who make them, those who make idols, will become like them." So you make an idol, you worship an idol, you become like the idol. In other words, you become lifeless. Or 2 Kings chapter 17 puts it this way. It's talking again about idolaters, and it says, "They followed vanity and became vain." So you follow that which is vain, empty, and you yourself become that way. That, by the way, quite fascinatingly, is why Israel is often described as being stiff-necked. That particular Hebrew phrase, stiff-necked, first occurs in the context of the golden calf debacle in Exodus chapter 32, because the phrase itself is taken from the stubbornness of animals. They're stiff-necked. They don't want to do what you want them to do. And so Israel is described multiple times as stiff-necked because they began to resemble what they worshiped, and they reflected that worship to the world around them. So here's a couple examples. Let's start with an easy one: religious materialism. Now, we're all familiar with how stuff can seize control of our hearts and minds, right? In this religious kind of materialism. But how does that affect how we reflect that to the world around us? How does it affect how we resemble that in religious materialism? Well, here's how it works. We begin to think of ourselves almost exclusively in terms of being consumers. Have you noticed how often we use that word, consume? We're not only consuming food, but we're doing what? We're consuming entertainment, and we are consuming pleasure. And this also then begins to affect the way that we just kind of view humanity. The wondrous mystery of humanity is kind of flattened down to where it's nothing more than what we order from Amazon. Now, how does this affect how we reflect that to the people around us? Well, we begin to think of other people in terms of just being consumers as well, or customers. For instance, a place I used to work told us that we are to think of our fellow employees as internal customers and the people that we served as external customers, as if there's really nothing more to people than being consumers and customers and getting stuff and selling stuff and taking money and owing money. And when you think about this on a national level, as far as the impact that kind of this religious materialism makes, it's like this. So we begin to think of the health of our country, not in terms of, for instance, how well it's taking care of its citizens, especially the most vulnerable, but it all gets reduced down to the health, the financial health of our nation. So the GDP ends up being the altar upon which we burn our incense in regard to religious materialism. Or let's look at another modern example. We might call this religious sexuality. So when sex becomes a religion. And in religious sexuality, our biographies are no bigger than our bedrooms. And we begin to think of people, or people begin to think of themselves in terms of being a homosexual or a heterosexual or a bisexual or a transsexual or monogamous or whatever it might be, whatever term that you want to use. And so all of the mystery of human nature is just kind of flattened down to who we decide to sleep with, who we invite into our bedroom. So let me tell you, Aphrodite is not dead. She is alive and well, and she is still wreaking havoc. And this religious sexuality reflects the way that we see others, because we begin to see others as nothing more than a sexual object that we may or may not be interested in. So that's just a couple of examples: religious materialism and religious sexuality. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but 2020, it's kind of been a bad year, right? A lot of bad stuff, a lot of weird stuff been going on in this year. But I tell you, there is one good thing that I at least have found about 2020. 2020 has been a year of religious epiphany. And I think what's happening is this: people are they're so anxious, they're so full of fear and worry and doubt, and they're feeling isolated, they're feeling alone, they're scared of everything from corona, they're scared of riots and looting, they're scared of lots of different things. And so what happens is people begin to kind of drop their guard, and they kind of let their religion just kind of hang out there for all the world to see. And so it might turn out that their religion is nothing but something kind of based on conspiracy theories, right? Or you find out that somebody else's religion is sort of a suburbanized kind of Christian nationalism, where Jesus wears red, white, and blue, and he's chosen this candidate or that candidate to be our savior. As a rule of thumb, I think we can say this: in the dumpster fire year of 2020, where flames are going all around us, whoever you're looking to hold the fire extinguisher is probably the definition of what your religion really is. Okay, so to circle back to where we were before. We today and the people of Israel might seem very different, right? They're an ancient religious people and we're supposedly a modern and secularized society. But that's all smoke and mirrors. They are no different with regard to their humanity than we are. We might be better at hiding our religion in some years, but we're just as religious as the ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, and the ancient Hebrews. So the forms of religion, they might metamorphosize, but the religion remains the same. We are homo liturgicus. We are worshiping liturgical people. Now, with all that said, we are in a perfect position to consider really what I think is the most remarkable, the most astonishing part of the Exodus story. So given that the Israelites were dead drunk with idolatry in Egypt, given that the Israelites stubbornly kept wanting to go back to the land of Egypt. So given that the Israelites, when they get to Mount Sinai, right after God speaks the Ten Commandments, they more or less spit in his face by making the golden calf. And given that they repeatedly rebelled against him during those wilderness years. So given all of that, why in the world did God redeem them in the first place, right? Why didn't he just maybe look around and find a better nation to make into his covenant people? Why, after Israel, his bride, had cheated on him all these times, why didn't God replace her with someone else? Well, we have a real straightforward, simple answer to that question that God himself gives us in the book of Deuteronomy. It's this: because the Lord loved you, and because the Lord kept the oath he swore to your forefathers. Because he's, number one, a Lord of love, and because, number two, he's a God of his word. You see, back when God chose Israel, he never considered having, kind of the ancient version of The Bachelor, where he's the bachelor. And he's going to kind of, gather 30 nations around him and kind of hang out with them and get to know them and pick the one that was, especially important and attractive for him. It's not like he had a candlelight dinner with Miss Mesopotamia to discuss her righteousness, or went on a beach walk with Lady Ethiopia to discuss their finer points of atonement theory or something like that. No, here's how God operated. He chose an old, childless couple, Abraham and Sarah. And from their wrinkles and dentures, he made a little tiny family. And over time, that tiny family grew, and it got ugly and it got wicked. And the Israelites began to muddy themselves in the mar of idolatry that was in Egypt. But the Lord did with them what the Lord always does. He stooped down and he wiped their face clean, and in love, he placed his warm, forgiving lips upon Israel. And in doing that for Israel, the Lord shows us what he does for us. Now, it's no secret why we screw up our lives. It's no secret why we fracture our relationships. It's no secret why we're always endangering our faith. No great mystery as to why when God brings us out of slavery, we're always kind of gravitating back in that direction. All of that is no mystery. We know the home is where the heart is, and our hearts are always going to gravitate to the land of Egypt. So what does God do? God does for us what he's always done for his people. He loves us, and he sticks to his word. He loves us, and he sticks by what he has promised. So don't you imagine for a minute that the Lord is going to let you return to Egypt. And one way or another, he's going to keep you where he wants you to be. He loves you way too much to let you go back into prison. He's way too faithful to go back on the word that he has promised to you. What's happening is the Lord has brought us into freedom, and now he is in the process of kind of de-Egyptianizing us, right? You might think of this as sanctification. In fact, try this on for a definition of sanctification. Sanctification is God acclimating us to a post-Egyptian life of freedom. That's it. Sanctification is God acclimating us to a post-Egyptian life of freedom. And this, of course, this is a lifelong task of the Spirit. A.J. Swoboda is right when he says this. He says, we love the safety of the darkness over the violence of the light. Love that phrase. Light is scary, he says. It exposes the monsters. We might say that we love the dark prisons of Egypt over the blinding light of the wilderness that God is bringing us into, because liberation is frightening to those who have grown used to captivity. And you know, that's why we need a Moses, right? That's why we need a Moses, because we are not going to extricate ourselves from slavery. We're not going to break the chains and set ourselves free. We need God to send a Moses into the stinking prison in which we find ourselves and to break those chains and to bring us out. And that's precisely what God has done for us in this new and greater Moses, Jesus Christ. He has liberated us from that captivity. And he brings us into the wilderness, and it's no mistake that that's where he puts us. That's this life in this wilderness. Why? Because in the biblical imagination, the wilderness is not like where you film Naked and Afraid. And the wilderness is not where you take your family on a backpacking trip where you can, roast marshmallows over the campfire. The wilderness is where you go to realize that every breath that you breathe, every second of your life, every day, every night, every aspect of who you are is lived solely by the grace of God. In the wilderness, you get hungry, you get thirsty, you're surrounded by temptations, and you soon realize that the only one who's getting you through is the God of love. That's why he takes you into the wilderness. And in this wilderness, he's sort of like reshaping us into the people that he has created and recreated us to be. He has brought us into freedom. Paul says it this way. This is from Galatians 5. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and don't let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. You notice how he says that? He says it is for freedom he set you free. It's not for freedom to do something else. It's not for freedom to now go back under the 10 Commandments or for freedom to do this or do that. No, it's for freedom, period, full stop. That's why Christ has done for you what he's done. So when you leave Mount Sinai, you leave Mount Sinai in your rear view mirror. You don't depart from the cross to go back to the foot of Mount Sinai. That's the place of death. So Jesus didn't come down like to give us volume 2 of the 10 Commandments. Jesus didn't come down to download, an upgraded legal software onto the hard drive of our souls. Jesus came down to set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. The God of Israel will get the church, all of us who are individually members of the body of Jesus, the God of Israel will get the church to the promised land no matter what it takes. Because the Son of God continues to leap with his wild and reckless love into the prisons in which we find ourselves. He storms our Egypts that reek of idolatry and slavery, and he pries open our fingers that cling to these idols, and then he picks us up and he carries us into this blinding light of liberation. And let me tell you, at first it's overwhelming. It's scary. It's almost like it's too free. But Christ holds us and he whispers to us, I love you. And I have never stopped loving you. And your sin and your shame and all that bad stuff from your past, that no longer defines you. What defines you is my love. What defines you is my grace. What defines you is my heart that beats with an unstoppable mercy and love for you. That's what Christ says to us when he brings us out of the land of lies and out of the land of death into this place of freedom. He breaks the chains of enslavement. He throws them into the bottom of the Red Sea, and there they will rust to all eternity. Because God has brought us out of Egypt, and he's bringing us through the wilderness, and he will bring us to the promised land that is flowing with the milk of mercy and the honey of grace. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Thanks be to God for that gift.
All right, we're here with our good friend Chad Bird after he's just given that stirring presentation to talk a little bit more about, what it is in us, Chad, that constantly seems to long for old Egypt. First question for you. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about just sort of our religious hardwiring, is that oftentimes we're really unaware of the idols that lurk behind our desires. So, you think about the children of Israel when they complain to Moses, they don't complain like, I long for the toad god, or or whatever it might be.
Right.
But it's, I long for the glorious, delicious leeks and onions.
Yeah.
Why can't we have the good old days? Can you talk a little bit about why it is we so often have a hard time detecting sort of the deeper roots of those desires, that they really do have a religious substance to them behind everything else?
I think part of the reason that I hinted at in the video is that we forget that we are essentially religious people. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of been programmed by society to think that we can be a secular version of humanity, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. And really not have a religious aspect to ourselves. So there's an element of self-delusion that's going on here,
yeah,
where we don't realize that everything that we do is in one way or another religious. And so we make the mistake of just kind of seeing the surface, mm-hmm. and not seeing that what is behind that is this kind of this religious pull that pulls us toward one kind of false divinity, yeah. or another. So I think that's probably part of what's going on there. Just a lack of self-awareness of the fact mm-hmm. that we always lean in a religious direction, no matter what the issue might be.
Yeah. And we're always able to take things that even seem apparently non-religious and turn them into religious things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're all polytheistic. We're not monotheists in any sort of terms.
Yeah, that's a great point to make. I mean, of course, Christianity and Judaism, I mean, you look at it historically, they've transformed really the world. So that most people today, if you ask them, do you believe in a divinity? They would say, yeah, I believe there's a God, yeah. right? So that transformation has taken place. But at the same time, we've forgotten that actually we believe, at least in the way we practice, in many gods.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the polytheism of the Greeks and the Romans, it hasn't changed.
Right.
It just, it's kind of like gone behind a mask.
Yeah.
So now it doesn't look like a divinity, mm-hmm. but it actually is. And so, yeah, I mean, we're pulled in all of these various divinity directions. And because of that, that's kind of the essence of being a sinner. Being an essence of a sinner is to be polytheistic.
Yeah.
To have our heartstrings pulled toward this God or to that God. And all the while, the one God, the one true God is calling us back to himself, back to the truth.
Yeah.
You talked about the fact that we often talk about going back to Egypt or going back to slavery as going back home. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense of nostalgia there, but it's a nostalgia that's not really being honest to us. It's kind of feeding us these lies. What role does that play in our desire to go back to slavery and bondage?
Yeah, there's this kind of a crazy idea that we have that it's better in bondage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see that with the Israelites. Mm-hmm. When you look at the entire story of Israel, you're like, why would you want to go back there, right? When you had this terrible decree about the male children being thrown into the Nile, they were in slavery. So when you read the first part of Exodus, you think, oh man, those people are going to be so happy to get out of there.
Yeah.
And you skip a few chapters forward and they're like, we want to go back. We made a big mistake in following you out of here.
Yeah.
To kind of get back into that warm safety of prison, mm-hmm. it seems to be what the sinner wants to do. And anytime he's pulled into that blinding light of freedom, there's this desire to go back to that place. I mean, in my own life, and I'm sure in the lives of a lot of people who are watching this, you remember that time when now you look back and you're like, that was awful. I was in a dark prison. What in the world? Why did I not want to leave?
Yeah.
But the truth is that when you're in that place,
when you're full of maybe shame or guilt or regret, and you're behind these bars, you're thinking, this is just where I'm going to stay, because I'm afraid to hope. I'm afraid to believe. I'm afraid to love. And the only way that you're going to get out of there is through the work of another. It's going to take, Christ is going to have to dive into that place where you're at and break the chains and break the bars and bring you out. And sometimes he brings you out and you're kicking and screaming, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what happens with sinners.
Yeah.
But he brings you out, and you begin to realize just how wonderful liberation is. Because you gradually come to the realization that this is exactly the way God wants me to be.
Yeah.
And you look back and you're like, thank God that he freed me from that prison of shame and guilt.
I can't help, as you're talking about thinking about C.S. Lewis's conversion and calling himself the most reluctant convert, as he was brought into the faith. And yet, this all results in, of course, one of his great books, Surprised by Joy, that, as he is converted, as reluctant as he was, suddenly, as you described in your talk, it's this blinding light, this whole new way of living. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. One of the things you discover is that in liberation, there really is joy.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's maybe not the kind of joy that you expected, but it's the joy of realizing that you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. You don't have to bow down before these false divinities and seek from them that which the true God is ready and willing to give you by grace.
Yeah.
And so you experience this joy of actually realizing that where you're at in Christ is exactly where God has created you to be. It's not like it's a false identity. It's like your true identity. This is really who God wants you to be when the shame is gone and the guilt is gone and you're standing in Christ, knowing that God the Father is pleased with you. Yeah, that's a joy that nothing else can replace.
Yeah. We've kind of touched on this, but you talked about the fact that when Christ breaks those bonds and brings us out, we are in the wilderness, as the Israelites were. Does that feel like freedom? Should it feel actually like liberation to the person in that moment, or does it sometimes feel like something else?
It's kind of a back and forth. So there are days when it does feel like freedom, and there are days when it feels like you're kind of dragging around chains still. And that's of course why we can never rely on our feelings as the foundation of actually reality. Because I get up in the morning and I'm going to feel a certain way. Then I have a cup of coffee and I feel differently. And then I get a bad email and I feel bad again. And then I call my wife and I feel good. So our emotions, are like that. And that's the way life is. I mean, I have a bad week and I have a good week, and that's why we can't ultimately base anything on these emotions and these feelings. Instead, we base it on the solid, unchanging promise of God. And as we're going through the desert, as we're moving from kind of water hole to water hole, if you will, to use that metaphor, I mean, it's great. There's this feeling of joy and happiness maybe when you're at the water hole, and then you go through a time when you're between those, and it's difficult. But the consistency is Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. The one he's walked the wilderness ahead of us. He's already been down this path. And he's going to walk with us and carry us and bring us finally to that promised land.
Yeah. Our feelings of freedom don't change the reality that we're actually free.
Exactly. Yes.
That's so hard for us to get a handle on, right? I mean, because we're just such emotional creatures, and there's emotions are not inherently bad. God created us with them, but we're prone to sort of discerning where we're at with God, where we're at with the world by how we feel in any given moment. And I think one of the things that you've alluded to is constantly going back to, what does God say?
Yes.
What does God say about me? And to the degree that we anchor ourselves there, the more freedom.
Yeah. I've said this many times, so people who are watching maybe have heard me say this, but I love the quote. It's from Ken Corby, one of my favorite professors, and he was just riffing off of Luther when he said this, but it fits here. He says that when you want to see the work of God, you pluck out your eyeballs and you stick them in your ears. In other words, you don't base truth upon what you see or what what your emotions see. You
Yeah.
base reality upon what God has said.
Yeah.
So when you want to see how God is at work in your life, don't rely on the two liars that are embedded in your face. Instead, rely upon what God has said to you in his word. And it's that external word that is going to provide us with the certainty of what God is doing in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there's I guess one final question, as I think about how this translates out to, our neighbor. You say that, what defines our freedom as Christians, as exiles of Egypt, is God's love and his grace for us. That's that identity question. But what does this freedom mean for our neighbors who are still in bondage, who are still in Egypt? Are we people that are flaunting freedom? And what does it mean to be people that are freed, still mingling in a world that is filled with people in bondage?
I can't quote where this is at, chapter verse. Maybe you could, but Paul talks somewhere about how people sneak in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus. I've always loved that image. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in such a way as individuals and as churches that people were like, I need to find out what this freedom is all about. I'm going to sneak in and I'm going to spy out what this freedom is actually all about. Because there is an attractiveness to liberation. People see that and they're like, what is that all about? So I think that's one aspect of that. And of course, just to when we have the chance to tell them about what this liberation is all about. Listen, there's another place besides Egypt. It's called Jerusalem. And let me tell you how you can get there. There's one who's come to liberate us, to break the chains, to bleed the blood that it takes to get us free. And he's going to carry you out of Egypt. He's going to carry you through the wilderness. He's going to carry you across the Jordan River into the land flowing with milk and grace. And he alone is going to accomplish this. And so that freedom that we have in him is a freedom that is for all of us.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think a lot of times churches, instead of talking about how freedom is attractive, they talk more in terms of about how discipleship will be attractive or how we live our lives. And those don't necessarily have to contradict each other.
Right.
No. But when you forget the freedom part, it quickly becomes a law and another type of bondage for the Christian and for the person who's viewing the Christian who's like, I don't want any of that.
Yeah, we've all come from backgrounds where we've probably heard the phrase, I'm just afraid that I've ruined my witness.
Yes.
It's like if I've sinned in some way or if I've fallen short in some way, I've ruined my witness. Well, usually what that means is it's people are looking at me to be a moral exemplar in order to show that I'm really free. This tweaks that a little bit, right, Chad?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, when we do think we've ruined our witness, the witness that we can give is, I really screwed up.
Yes.
Hugely. I did some horrible things. And you know what? God didn't smash me with his boot. Instead, he reached down into the muck and the mire and he pulled me out and he washed me clean and he said, I love you. And you are forgiven. And that kind of witness of absolution and witness of freedom is the kind of message that we have, the kind of witness that we have for the world.
Amen.
That's great. Thank you, Chad. Well, thanks so much, Chad, for sitting around with us and talking shop a little bit. We have one final closing message coming up in just a moment, folks. So don't leave your computer, don't leave your phones or whatever you're watching this on. One final message coming up from our executive director, Scott Keith.